Have you ever been judged by the very people who once prayed with you? Have you ever felt the door of a place called home slam shut right in your face just because someone lied about you? This is not just a story. It's a reminder that sometimes when men close their doors, God opens his from the heavens. It begins on a cold morning. A man walks alone, his Bible clutched to his chest. The street is silent except for the sound of his shoes against wet pavement. He's no longer called pastor. Now people cross the street to avoid him. But what they don't know is that God never stopped calling him my servant. He was thrown out of the church, but heaven was about to use the broken streets to preach through him. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. Psalm 113:7. And if you've ever felt like you've been cast aside, this story is for you. Stay with us until the end. And if something in this story speaks to you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe and let us know in the comments. Have you ever been rejected and later realized it was God's redirection? It started with a whisper, a soft, calculated rumor carried by the wrong lips at the right moment. Pastor Elijah Green had served that congregation for over 13 years. He wasn't perfect, but he was faithful. He had married couples, buried loved ones, sat beside hospital beds at 3 a.m., and prayed when everyone else had already left the room. But all it took was one lie, to unravel a life built on service. The church board didn't ask questions. They didn't pray. They just listened to the voice that spoke the loudest, not the voice of God, but of fear. The accusation, misusing funds, no evidence, no hearing, just silence, and a locked office door. That Sunday, Elijah stood on the pulpit for what he didn't know would be the last time. His sermon was on forgiveness. Irony hung in the air like smoke from a candle just extinguished. He looked out and saw eyes that refused to meet his, arms folded, smiles forced, and he knew something was already broken. After the final amen, the elder chairman approached him and said, without eye contact, "We'll be handling next week's message internally." No explanation, no grace, just a cold shoulder and a quiet exile. The sanctuary that once echoed with songs now rang with the sound of judgment. The next morning, the email went out. A formal removal. No farewell service. No thank you. Elijah stared at the screen. Due to recent concerns, Pastor Green will no longer be leading our congregation. That was it. His name erased with a line of text. People he once counseled shared it like gossip. Others nodded in fake concern. Only 2 people called him that day. One was his mother, the other a homeless man he used to bring food to on Thursdays. No one from the church board, not a single deacon. He stood by his window watching raindrops crawl down the glass, whispering, "God, are you still with me?" By Friday, his keys didn't work at the church anymore. His office was emptied, books gone, the Bible he kept by the altar, missing. Even the photo of his late wife that sat on his desk had vanished. No one returned his calls. One member told him they were instructed not to engage with him until further notice. The place where he once baptized children had become a courtroom without trial. And Elijah? A ghost wandering the hallways of a house he helped build. All he could carry was a worn-out satchel, his Bible, and the ache of betrayal. He sat at the park that evening, surrounded by the noise of passing cars, staring at the horizon as the sun bled into dusk. No collar, no title, just a man who had lost everything except his faith. A child passed by and smiled at him. Elijah smiled back, hiding the tremor in his lips. He thought, if they could take my pulpit, could they also take my purpose? He didn't know it yet, but his purpose was about to be reborn. Not in a church, but in a place. The next Sunday morning came like a ghost, silent, cold, and unfamiliar. Elijah had never missed a service in over a decade, not even when his wife was in the hospital. But this time, he wasn't preparing a sermon. He wasn't lacing up his shoes with purpose. He was sitting at the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, while church bells rang in the distance, bells that once signaled belonging. Now, they sounded like a funeral. His name had been erased from the bulletin. His seat was filled by another. The man who once opened the church was now locked out, like a stranger. He walked by the building anyway, unable to stop himself. His heart led his steps. It was early. People were just arriving. He stood across the street, watching families gather, children run, and ushers shake hands with smiles. But no one looked his way. No one waved. The same members who used to say, "We love you, Pastor," now pretended not to see him. His hands trembled in his coat pockets. The sanctuary lights flickered inside, casting golden warmth through stained glass. But for Elijah, the door might as well have been sealed with bricks. How strange to see the place that once gave him life now feel like a graveyard. The wooden sign out front still read, "A church for the broken." Elijah smiled bitterly. Unless you're the one they've chosen to break. He walked away before the first hymn began, not trusting his legs to stand still any longer. The wind picked up. The sky darkened. The same streets he once drove with confidence now felt like a maze. His fingers clutched the strap of his satchel tighter. All he had left was that old Bible and the fire still flickering, barely, in his soul. He whispered, "If I'm not a pastor anymore, what am I?" That afternoon, he sat alone on the bench outside the community shelter. He could still hear echoes of sermons he'd preached, ringing in his own ears, messages about storms, about trusting God in the valley. Now he was living every verse, every word, a man with nothing to offer but a lifetime of experience, and no platform to share it. Yet, in that stillness, something shifted. He noticed a young woman crying near the steps. No one else approached her. Elijah rose, unsure why, and walked over. He simply said, "Do you need someone to pray with you?" Her eyes widened. She nodded. And right there, under an overcast sky, they prayed. No pulpit, no spotlight, no altar call, just two broken people and one very present God. When Elijah opened his eyes, she was smiling. Not because her problems had disappeared, but because someone had seen her, really seen her. Elijah sat back down, stunned, not by the prayer, but by how alive he felt for the first time in days. Maybe this wasn't exile. Maybe it was a beginning, because sometimes the doors we mourn are the ones God had to close, to lead us where he's actually trying to use us. The next few days blurred into one long walk. Elijah wandered the city streets with no destination, just a quiet hunger for clarity. He wasn't homeless in the traditional sense. He still had a room in a friend's basement, but spiritually, emotionally, he had nowhere to belong. The routine that once gave rhythm to his days had vanished. Now it was sunrise and sidewalk, sunset and silence. All he had was a Bible under his arm, worn soft by years of sermons and counseling, now his only companion. He sat on benches, walked alleyways, and leaned against brick walls, still warm from the sun. In his coat pocket, he kept a handful of old sermon notes. He didn't read them to preach. He read them to survive. Words he'd once spoken to others now whispered back to him, like echoes of hope. God is near to the brokenhearted. Even in exile, he walks with you. It felt strange, not being a leader, not having a title. But the more he walked, the more he noticed something he hadn't before. Brokenness was everywhere, not just in pews. It lived in bus stops, in underpasses, in the faces of strangers who carried invisible weights. One morning, as he crossed a bridge overlooking the river, Elijah saw a man yelling at the water. Others walked by, staring or shaking their heads. But Elijah stopped. He sat near the man and simply asked, "Want to talk?" At first, the man cursed him, but Elijah didn't leave. He just waited. 10 minutes later, the man began to cry. Not because Elijah said anything profound, but because someone stayed. When he finally left, the man said, "You're the first person who listened without judgment." Elijah walked away shaken, not by the story, but by how right it felt to be there. He started carrying extra sandwiches, water bottles, and tissues in his satchel. Not because he had much to give, but because giving, even from lack, healed something inside. He stopped waiting for a pulpit. The streets became his sanctuary, the sidewalk his stage. He would sit by addicts, pray with teenagers, share scriptures with strangers who didn't even know his name. And still, he carried that Bible, not as a symbol, but as a lifeline. Every time he touched its pages, it reminded him, "You were never called by a building. You were called by me." And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the city began to change around him, not because he performed miracles, but because he saw what others ignored. He loved what others dismissed. And in doing so, Elijah found pieces of himself again. Sometimes, you have to lose your place to discover your purpose. It was past midnight when Elijah found himself sitting under a flickering streetlight on 9th Avenue. The bench was cold, the wind sharp, and the city unusually quiet, as if the world had paused just long enough for God to whisper. He had no place to be, but his heart was burning. That day, he'd spoken with 3 people: a teenager who ran away from home, a woman who hadn't eaten in 2 days, and a war veteran who couldn't stop trembling. Elijah had prayed with each of them. No miracles happened, no flash of divine thunder, but something deeper was stirring, something Elijah couldn't name yet. As the cold settled deeper into his bones, Elijah opened his Bible and laid it across his lap. He wasn't reading it for anyone else. No audience, no sermon, just him, just God. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages. They stopped at Psalm 27. "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." He exhaled sharply. A single tear rolled down his cheek, unnoticed by the few passing cars. He looked up at the streetlight above, blinking faintly through the fog, and then he prayed, not loudly, not with eloquence, but with raw, trembling honesty. "Lord, I don't need my name back. I don't need their approval, but I need to know you're still with me." The wind answered with a soft gust. A leaf tumbled across the sidewalk. No thunder, no voice from heaven, but Elijah felt it, that unmistakable warmth that had once visited him in hospital rooms and funerals. It wasn't emotion, it was presence. He closed his eyes. The noise of the city faded, and for a moment all that existed was that tiny pool of light, a worn Bible, and a broken man offering what little he had left. When he opened his eyes, a boy stood nearby. No more than 10, dirty clothes, no shoes, holding a plastic bag of empty cans. He stared at Elijah without speaking. Elijah smiled gently and asked, "Are you cold?" The boy nodded. Elijah took off his coat and wrapped it around the child. No questions, just kindness. The boy whispered, "Thank you. Are you a priest or something?" Elijah chuckled quietly and replied, "Something like that." The boy sat beside him, and they shared that bench for over an hour. Elijah never asked the boy's name. He didn't need to. Sometimes ministry isn't about sermons or altars. Sometimes it's sitting with the hurting in silence, under the glow of a broken lamp. When the boy left, Elijah remained still, heart warm despite the cold. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't asking for direction. He was simply saying, "Here I am, Lord. If this is the field, I'll serve in the dark." And that's when he realized, a prayer whispered in the street is not weaker than one echoed in a cathedral. It might be even closer to heaven. Her name was Camilla. Elijah never forgot it. She was sitting on the edge of a fountain downtown, her eyes red and her hands shaking. It was morning, too early for most to notice a woman unraveling in public. But Elijah saw her, not because she cried, but because something about her posture mirrored his own heart. He approached slowly, as he always did now, not with answers, but with presence. He said, "You look like someone who's holding too much alone." She didn't flinch. She just nodded, like she had no energy left to pretend. And in that nod, Elijah found an open door, not to preach, but to listen. They sat for nearly an hour, barely speaking. Camilla eventually told him about the miscarriage, how her fiancé left afterward, how she couldn't even step inside a church anymore because of the looks, the whispers, the shame. Elijah didn't respond with theology, he just listened. And when she finished, he said something that surprised even himself. "God didn't leave you. People did." She began to cry again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't collapse. It was release. Elijah offered to pray, not standing, not with hands raised, just sitting on that stone bench beside her. The prayer wasn't poetic. It was simple. "God, remind her that you still see her." When he opened his eyes, Camilla was staring at him like she was seeing light for the first time in months. "You're the first person who didn't make me feel dirty for being broken," she whispered. Elijah smiled, tears in his own eyes now. "That's because I'm broken too." That day changed both of them. Camilla didn't find instant healing, but she found hope. And Elijah? He found confirmation that all the pain, the rejection, the wandering, it wasn't random. God had taken the pulpit from beneath his feet so he could kneel beside people like Camilla, not to preach down to them, but to sit at their level, to see them, to remind them they were still beloved. Word began to spread, not in newspapers, not in videos, but through whispers on benches and doorsteps. "There's a man with a Bible and kind eyes. He'll pray with you if you ask." Elijah never introduced himself as pastor again. Now he was just Elijah, a servant, a vessel, a listener. And somehow that was more holy than any title he'd ever carried, because sometimes the first person who listens is the first step towards someone believing again. And for Elijah, that was enough. Elijah never sought miracles. He never shouted on corners or laid hands in dramatic fashion. But slowly, without warning, things began to happen. Quiet, unexplainable things. A man with chronic pain in his legs stopped limping after Elijah prayed with him at a bus stop. A woman who hadn't spoken in weeks due to grief suddenly began to sing during their shared prayer in a laundromat. A boy who ran away returned home the day after Elijah gave him a Bible and said, "You're still worthy of love." Elijah didn't take credit. In fact, he avoided attention altogether. But people started calling it something. Street miracles. He didn't ask for offerings. He didn't organize anything. He just showed up, consistently, humbly, every day. And in the quiet corners of the city, the forgotten ones began to believe again. Not in religion, not in a system, but in a God who still walks the streets. People who hadn't prayed in years found themselves whispering to the sky after talking to him. And Elijah? He just kept moving, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because it had become the air he breathed. One afternoon, he knelt beside a woman asleep on the sidewalk. Her body was fragile. He thought she was gone. But then she stirred. Elijah offered water and a quiet prayer. The next day, she found him again, not to ask for help, but to give him her last $5. "You reminded me I'm not invisible," she said. Elijah refused the money. Instead, he held her hand and prayed again. That moment became a ripple. She later joined a shelter and helped others get off the street. Not because of Elijah, but because God's mercy had touched her through him. These weren't the miracles people filmed. No lights, no platforms, just whispers in alleyways. But Elijah knew these were the miracles Jesus always talked about. Healing of spirit, restoration of dignity, the kind that starts when someone says, "I see you," and God does too. It didn't matter if the world didn't believe it. The people did, and that was enough. Because sometimes the greatest miracles are the ones no one applauds except heaven. It started with murmurs. People began gathering around Elijah before he even spoke. At first it was 2 or 3, then 5, then a dozen. No flyers, no posters, just word of mouth. A woman would say, "There's a man on 5th Street who'll pray with you." A teenager would whisper, "He doesn't judge, he just listens." Little by little, Elijah found himself surrounded, not in a crowd hungry for spectacle, but in souls starving for peace, for truth, for presence. He didn't lead with a sermon. He just asked, "How's your heart today?" And revival, real, raw, unchoreographed, began to pulse through the city. One evening, he stood near an abandoned lot where addicts used to gather. Now, that lot had folding chairs, a few crates, and a broken speaker someone donated. No roof, no altar, just sky above and pavement below. And yet, every Friday night, it became sacred ground. They'd sing without instruments, share stories without shame, pray without rehearsed words, cry without hiding their faces. Elijah didn't lead it. He just opened his Bible and waited, and the Spirit did the rest. Camilla was there week after week. So was the boy with no shoes, and the man who yelled at rivers. Each of them brought someone else. The circle widened. No hierarchy, no program, just broken hearts and open hands. Elijah would look around and whisper, "This is church," not because of the setting, but because of the surrender, because in the middle of asphalt and traffic noise, heaven listened. He never called it revival. Others did. A local journalist wrote an article titled, "Streetlight Ministry Turns Pain into Prayer." Elijah never read it. He didn't want his name in lights. He wanted lives to be lit from within. And that was happening. One night, a young man knelt in tears and said, "I was going to end my life, but someone said I should come here first." Elijah knelt beside him, held him, prayed, and later gave him the same Bible he'd carried since his exile began. It was torn, marked, full of coffee stains and fingerprints, but it held power. Not from ink, from the life it walked through. Because revival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a whisper on the sidewalk that someone finally heard. It was a Sunday morning like any other. Elijah was sitting on a crate in the empty lot, watching the sun climb above the city skyline. He'd already prayed with 2 people before 8 a.m. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of coffee from a nearby food truck. Birds chirped overhead, and somewhere down the street, a saxophone played. It was peaceful, the kind of peace Elijah had stopped expecting in his old life. Then he saw her, walking slowly across the cracked pavement, heels clicking, eyes locked on him. It was Deaconess Margaret Hale, head of the board that had once voted to remove him. She looked out of place among the folding chairs and street-dwelling saints, her hair perfect, her coat expensive, her Bible untouched. Elijah stood, unsure what to say. She approached without a smile. For a moment he feared another blow, another wound from the past. But then she spoke. "I've been watching. I didn't believe it at first, but I had to come see for myself." Her voice cracked. "They say people are being healed here." Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to defend, didn't need to explain. He simply asked, "Would you like to sit?" Margaret looked around. The uneven ground, the worn faces, the simple joy. Then she nodded and sat beside a man who once begged for food in front of her church. That day, she stayed the entire service, listened to every story, sang every song, and when Elijah prayed, she whispered, "Amen," not from duty, but from something deeper, something she hadn't felt in years. Over the next weeks, more familiar faces returned. An elder, a former choir member, even the new pastor, eyes wide with humility. They didn't come to reclaim Elijah. They came to understand what they'd lost. Not a man, but the move of God they had mistaken for messiness. The fire they'd labeled disorder. The truth they'd once silenced. Elijah never sought vindication, but grace has a way of circling back, not to elevate, but to reconcile, not to reopen wounds, but to show what healing looks like. He never returned to the pulpit, but the pulpit came to him in the faces of those who once turned away. And that day, as the sun set behind the city skyline, he realized something powerful. When God restores, he doesn't just rebuild your life, he redeems your story. It was just another Friday night, or so Elijah thought. The alley behind the lot had become a place of overflow. When the crates filled up, people would gather there, singing, praying, weeping. There was no electricity, no sound system, just voices and hearts. That night, the clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of rain, but no one left. They came anyway, young and old, clean and dirty, addicted and sober, all drawn by something no one could explain. Elijah stood near the back, not preaching, just watching, and then it happened. The moment began with a song, one voice trembling through the alley like smoke. Camilla was singing. The same Camilla who once couldn't walk near a church. Her voice cracked, imperfect but powerful. She sang about grace, about mercy, and one by one voices joined her. No instruments, just harmony born from pain. Then someone began to pray aloud. Then another, then another. People knelt on the concrete, lifted their arms, cried openly. It wasn't emotional hype. It was something sacred, like heaven itself had bent low, not over a temple, but over an alley no one valued. And then the rain began to fall. Soft at first, gentle droplets kissing foreheads and shoulders. No one ran, no one screamed. They stood in it, raised their faces to the sky like flowers. Elijah looked up, eyes blinking through tears and rain. Lord, what is this? And in his spirit he felt a whisper. This is my church. Not confined, not restrained, alive, uncontainable. A man who had never spoken in public stood up and confessed his addiction. Another cried out for forgiveness. A teenage girl said she wanted to live again. Every corner of that alley was alive with repentance and restoration. And through it all, Elijah didn't lead. He simply knelt in the mud and wept, not from sadness, but from awe, because he knew this wasn't revival. It was resurrection. That night, no one wanted to leave. The rain kept falling. The prayers kept rising. And for a brief, eternal hour, that alley was the holiest ground on earth. People hugged. Others sat in silence, faces glowing. Hearts were healed. Chains were broken. And not a single camera captured it. Because some miracles aren't meant for show. They're meant to be remembered, in spirit and in truth. And as Elijah walked home soaked and barefoot, he whispered, "You really don't need 4 walls to tear open heaven." The city had changed, or maybe Elijah had changed enough to finally see it. The alleys, the sidewalks, the broken benches, they were no longer forgotten places. They were sanctuaries. Each crack in the pavement had held a prayer. Each corner had caught a tear. Elijah no longer walked with shame. He walked with quiet authority, not because he had reclaimed his title, but because he had remembered his purpose. No stage, no robe, just presence. And wherever he stood, God showed up. One morning, a child ran up to him and said, "Are you the pastor of the streets?" Elijah laughed, not mockingly, but with deep, healed joy. He knelt down and replied, "I'm just a servant, son." But something in that title, pastor of the streets, stayed with him, because that's what he had become. A shepherd with no walls, no ceiling, no fence, guiding souls who would never step into a sanctuary, but who were desperate for God nonetheless. Camilla was now leading a support group. The boy with no shoes, He wore boots and read scripture to others. The man who once screamed at rivers now organized cleanups along the waterfront. And Elijah, he just kept walking, kept praying, kept showing up in the quiet places where hope is hard to find. Because now he knew God never needed a building to use him. The fire of heaven had always burned in the margins. Sometimes he'd walk past his old church building. It stood tall, beautiful, echoing with polished sermons. He no longer felt bitterness, only gratitude, because being cast out had led him into the deepest calling of his life. He'd smile, nod politely, and keep walking, not to escape the past, but to keep embracing the future only God could write. And each time someone asked, "How did this all begin?" he would answer the same way, with a lie that broke me, and a God who rebuilt me without a single brick. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. If you've ever felt rejected by the very people who were supposed to love you, if you've ever thought God stopped using you because others stopped believing in you, let this story remind you, God's calling isn't tied to titles, buildings, or applause. It's tied to your heart, your willingness, your surrender. If this story touched you, leave a comment below. Tell us, have you ever been used by God in the middle of your own brokenness? And don't forget to subscribe. We have more stories like this that will renew your faith.